Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I think it's a very important topic for the continent, right? But before talking about immobility, I think it's important that we acknowledge the constraints that the continent has, right, in terms of energy reliability and transport infrastructure in general, right? So I think the first question that I have to all panelists is how can we make sure to advance immobility, that is EV trucks, EV infrastructure, motorcycles, while also making sure that we have reliable and clean energy access to the African population, but also reliable, safe, and operational roads in the continent, and operational all year long. So maybe I'll start with Abiola.
Well, thank you very much, Matthias, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. The Africa Finance Corporation, we always value invitations to sessions like this because it helps us to contribute, some of our thoughts, knowledge, but also gain a lot and learn and mingle with industry practitioners. So thanks for having us. I think from our perspective, if you generally look at the infrastructure state on the continent, there's no overestimating rather the fact that there's a need for massive intervention. Depending on whom you listen to, it's $50 to $100 billion of infrastructure requirement on an annual basis across Africa, and EV infrastructure and all of that, e-mobility is of course part of that. We look at it more from a sort of a streamlined perspective, which focuses on what I'll call streams or themes. And within those themes, we then find the right solutions that plug into the different areas. So whereas we would not look at EV or e-mobility as a standalone element, we look at it within the context of three major areas. One is what we call the localized frame. And within the localized frame, what we're saying there is that the continent needs to be more self-reliant. So whatever investments, whether it's on the infrastructure side, whether it's on the industrial side, on the EV side, whatever infrastructure requirements for Africa to be more localized, to industrialize more is very important. And within that frame, you can look at the need to beneficiate more on the continent, whether it's on the mineral side, but also on the agriculture side as well. And enabling all of this is an efficient transportation network. So we advocate a lot for investments that are focused on cross-border infrastructure. So whereas there's a need for within each country to have quite an efficient chain of communication by way of transportation, but creating those linkages, whether it's by cross-border roads or cross-border rail projects, is very important. So that's the first frame. And then the second frame for us is what we call the rebuild phase. And in the rebuild phase is really not just deploying capital in all of these infrastructure solutions, but it's really ensuring that this infrastructure is resilient, right, to effects of climate change in the future. And within that frame is the adaptation frame, and also also have the mitigation phase, which is where we're looking at a lot of EV solutions. How can we replace fossil fuels as much as possible? But also within that phase, we think about a more pragmatic and sustainable approach for Africa to transitioning on the sustainability chain. So, we're talking a continent that has, 600 million homes without electricity and the like. So it's not going to be a straight cutover to sort of EV infrastructure, but the continent also has a lot of gas. And so for us at the AFC, we continue to see gas as a transition fuel, which means that a balanced approach that is looking at how we can industrialize in the short to medium term with gas is very important, but also at the same time building that capacity to replace several local transportation networks that are based on fossil fuels with electricity as much as possible. Because if you look at Africa, the transport chains are so inefficient. For the average business, transportation cost alone approaches as much as 50% for the average business on the continent. And transportation contributes about 30% of the emissions in a country like Nigeria, for example. So it's very important to reduce the emissions in that sector in general. But we have to keep in mind the overall need to industrialize, which means that we need gas investments at the same time as we are making this EV investment. And then just to wrap up, the last phase for us is what we call the financial innovation, which we call Finovate. And there we talk about creative instruments that can be used to finance this transition. So that's how we look at it. It's a balanced approach that is looking at the right infrastructure with the right solutions and focusing on the right thing. And the right thing for us is industrialization on the continent. So investments that don't speak to how we can, process raw materials within Africa would not appeal to us, for example, at the AFSIC.
So I think it's important not to put the cart before the horse. Last night we were at the dealmakers dinner in the London Transport Museum, and one of the things talking there was about the transition from horsepower to motorised vehicles in London. And it happened in the space of 15 years, and it didn't happen because of government intervention, right? There were lots of people saying, London was going to be buried in horse shit if the things carried on. And of course, that never happened because the transition happened. And so I think, firstly, it's really important to recognise as we electrify, we're not electrifying just to save the planet, although that's a nice byproduct. We're electrifying because it's much, much more efficient. You are putting in a cheaper fuel and you are using a lot less of that fuel. It is the right way to go, and actually there's an opportunity here to leapfrog. So I think, yes, we've got 600 million households that aren't electrified, but you have to take a market-led approach, right? When you electrify an electric truck, you take $10 of energy and you turn it into $200 of revenue, right? The next day. If you electrify a house, you earn $2 a month of energy bill, and a few years later, you have benefits, but you don't have economic direct benefits. And you made a point about roads, right? One approach is to wait until we've tarmacked Africa. Our approach is to go and build an electric truck that works on those roads. And that way you can get straight to immediate benefits. And people say, as the roads improve, you can increase the speeds. And that's great, and you get more benefit. But you can get a benefit right now from using electric vehicles on dirt roads.
I think even the Western world is facing this problem on electrifying the vehicles. And so how you sync the grid or the energy access piece alongside the scale of e-mobility needs to be very carefully thought out, because you will tend to get charging spikes on the grid. And if you then think about Africa's growth, the estimation is urban populations will double to like 1.4 billion people by 2050, which is just insane in terms of what it will need for electrifying urban environments, or just energizing them in all ways, petrol, electricity, or whatever. But I think the grids themselves, or the energy access piece for e-mobility, needs to be very well thought about in order for it to actually happen. And the grids today are not where they need to be for that. So there needs to be investments both sides. If you just try and do e-mobility and throw it in, at some point the system breaks. Yeah. So there needs to be investment both ways.
Well, thanks so much. And I actually touched on the topic of my next question, which is how do we ensure that electrification of transportation is actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions if several of the electricity grids in Africa are still powered by fossil fuels? So that's one question. And if you could also comment on, so we're talking about the benefits in terms of carbon emission reduction, but could you also comment on the broader social and economic benefits for Africa in terms of rolling out e-mobility technologies, especially considering, as you mentioned, that the continent has the majority of population at below 30 years old. There's a huge investment opportunity there. I think at Impacta Global we see that, but I wanted to hear from you guys as well. Maybe start with Eric this time.
Yeah, I think, like Simon said, they're more efficient vehicles, so they're cheaper. That's just a good thing. It's just a good thing for people on the ground, period. They're actually a lot more fun to drive. It's a separate thing. I mean, these things are fast. It's just a better product overall. But you need to find ways to drive the build out of this energy access point. I don't think this needs to be tackled. Naturally, you're not getting tailpipe fumes. So just a city is better on EVs no matter what. The fact that grids are gas or solar powered, I think is a completely separate thing. If you can transition through gas, do it. Just get the grids there or the energy access point as a start. Don't try and force too many things going on at once. I mean, these things have to progress. I mean, the West's entire economies are built off oil, not off solar. So to put the pressure down on Africa to do that feels to me like an extreme conflict, just generally. We should do it, but not by pressure. Get the energy there, let e-mobility come through, better product, and transition yourself across is what I would say on this.
I think there's a lot of myths being written by a lot of people with embedded interests in oil about like how clean are EVs. The fundamental physics of it is if you put electrons into an electric car, you'll use 90-something% of those to drive the car forward, and you have a tiny little bit of noise and a tiny little bit of heat. A petrol combustion engine, diesel engine, if you get 30% of the, you waste 70% of the energy you put in. They just spew out heat and noise and oil and dirt and all this stuff. So kind of, it's, unless you've got the world's dirtiest grid, you are better off doing energy. And as Eric says, the two are separate, right? If you solve the energy, if the energy consumption is in the form of electrons, you can then decide what is more efficient, gas or solar or whatever. But to my thinking, and I'm just a practical engineer, if you have a machine that requires you to put nothing in and energy comes out, versus a machine that requires you to put expensive imported fuel into to get electricity out, I'd vote for buying the first machine. Like, the economics have got to be better over the lifetime. And I think, just to go on to your second point, I think it's really important, the fundamental. I remember I was asked this question a couple of years ago in here about investment in sectors like, why did roads who paid for the roads in the US, who paid for the railroads, the canals in this country? It wasn't governments and stuff, it was private sector seeing the value of communication, because really, goods only have value if they are delivered. Everybody loves manufacturing and says it's value creation. It's not. Logistics is value creation, because when I turn up with something, you will pay for it. Now, what we see repeatedly is when we take people from using bicycles, buses, and head carrying to move goods and say you can now use an electric truck, they scale their businesses tenfold, because instead of spending all day worrying about moving things and pushing bicycles up hills, they're spending their time being productive. And that generates the revenue you need to drive the EV revolution. It shouldn't be interventions from other parties.
No, I think Eric and Simon actually said it all. Which is why I referenced earlier on that the transition for a continent like Africa has to be pragmatic and sustainable. And for us, it really comes down to one thing, and that's leadership, right? And creating the right vision. And that then sort of flows into how projects are, how ideas are generated, how the projects are developed, and ultimately how they are implemented. We were assessing an opportunity recently, which was to deploy EV buses on one of the African countries. And the power was going to be generated by diesel-fired engines. And said, this doesn't make sense. How do you bring in such dirty fuel to generate the power, then to produce the electricity to power the buses? So, we had to then relook at the project, working with the sponsor, and say, how can we find cleaner solutions for the power generation? But of course, cost becomes quite prohibitive as well for most cleaner solutions in terms of energy. Renewable, for example, depending on how you slice or dice it, solar panels mostly are imported. And that could mean that costs are prohibitive for most projects. So one of the conversations we are engaging in as well is with some sponsors to say, how do we provide the right capacity to produce panels on the continent, for example, that could bring the cost down considerably. So what am I trying to say? We need to find how in delivering projects we focus on first the industrialization piece and say, to what extent do we maybe deploy gas, for example, depending on the size of power required. But then we need to have a plan to transition over time. One of our investments recently, we were looking to do an expansion. And by the time we did the economics, it wasn't going to make sense for us to use solar solution for the expansion. And so we had to get creative, but we also did analysis around the social economic, so coming to your second point, the social economic benefits for that community and for that country if we did the expansion. We had an obligation on the concession agreement with the government to do the expansion anyway, so we're going to pay fines if we didn't do it. But it had to be done in an economical way. So we had to find a solution where we deployed gas in the interim for about 1.5 years, and then we transitioned over time. And as the project was making money, it was then able to better absorb the potentially higher cost of deploying solar solutions. So it's still sort of pragmatic planning and implementation approach we need to think of. The cycle has to be self-sustaining, and it has to make sense end-to-end. And that all starts from in our minds, it all starts with leadership. And then the leadership, comes up with the right ideas, which are then translated into implementable solutions. And having the right capacity is very important as well to implement those solutions. And that's one area we think that a lot could be improved on the continent of Africa, which I can speak a bit more about later when we talk a little bit more about implementation. Capacity is very important, and that sometimes is lacking in a way, but not necessarily due to unavailability, but just due to some bottlenecks within the system and just being able to do things the right way sometimes. Yeah.
No, thanks so much. And I think Eric touched a point that remind me. So at Impacta Global, we are making institutional capital flow from Europe and North America into sustainable infrastructure in Africa and Latin America. And one comment we received from an impact investor in Europe once was, wow, you're investing in roads in Africa, so that's increasing CO2 emissions. And you're like, well, wait, first of all, we are connecting people to healthcare facilities, to education facilities that they wouldn't be able to. And during rainy season, actually, it takes 17 hours to make this journey because the roads are just unusable. And now with this road, it would take 30 minutes. So you can't apply the same lens, in Europe or in the developed world as you would in Africa or Latin America.
The easiest way to lower emissions is keep people poor, right? All the stats say the wealthier you are, the more CO2 you emit, right? And it's not just hot air. But yeah, it's unfortunately a stupid argument by some of. But the key opportunity here is not to go through the wasteful industrial process that we have in the UK and particularly in the US, right? They have global emissions twice the UK, and there's a much more efficient point that can be hit that still delivers economic growth.
Oh, thank you. And I think turning to the next question about the e-mobility business models themselves, I think one of the challenges, and you can probably comment better than I can, but one of the challenges you guys face is the high upfront costs and the slow payback, right, the pulverized customer base. So turning to Abiola, and then please comment from the other panelists. What role can DFIs play in terms of blended finance structures to make these instruments, the financing these projects, more palatable, right, for institutional investors?
Quite a huge role, I would say, and we're an example of that. And the reason why DFIs are very important is because first is development focused, and so has a lot of sovereign backing from that sense. It's not purely 100% commercial. For example, we have a mix of public and private shareholders, which allows us to wear different hats depending on who we're talking to, depending on what the project is, where it is, and several other factors. And that in itself just feeds into what we see as the underlying solution, which is really flexibility with the financing, which takes me back to the financial innovation, which I mentioned earlier on. So DFIs really play a key role in developing those financial products that can be deployed to solve this kind of challenges that we've been talking about. I mentioned the project that we looked to invest in, and we had to go with the solution we didn't want initially, but then have a plan to transition. So all that blended financing is very key. But one thing we have been emphasizing at the AFC is how, as much as possible, African money needs to go into Africa. So it's okay to scream, go to IMF, which is currently going on in Washington, and scream to the Western world that the financial architecture does not favor the continent. But we've done an analysis which actually shows that we've got well over $4 trillion of idle capital generated within the continent. So that's a lot of money sitting in pension funds, sovereign wealth funds across the continent, in commercial banks, for example. So it's time for that capital to move from safe investments into strategic investments. And that is simply what we are about at the moment. Yes, we continue the strategic discussions around crowding in capital from other parts of the world. In fact, last week we had a delegation in Norway at the Norwegian African Business Association. We've been talking to Norway for a few good years. They've got about $2 trillion in terms of the size of their sovereign wealth fund. So we're talking to them, trying to get them comfortable about bringing some of that money into Africa. And we, as a DFI, one key role we can play for institutions like that is to provide them guarantee products, that give them a safe landing onto the continent. And so they take the AFC risk because we are A3 rated, which is investment grade. So you take AFC risk and we take the risk of the underlying project. So that's one key way that we de-risk financing solutions. Similar conversations we've been having with the Saudi investment fund as well. So we're having a lot of those conversations. Again, we have a team in Washington at the moment, but we can continue to do all of those on the side. The conversation is with the leadership of the continent, and how do we create the right legislations and regulations and frameworks to crowd in more of the capital that is generated within the continent into strategic projects on the continent. Because what ends up happening is that this capital flows into money market instruments in London, in New York, and across the world, and reaching those nations even more. But they're not benefiting the continent as much as they should. So we play a huge role, as I talked about the guarantee, also in advocacy. We're not the government, so we can't implement these things. But we have good and strong relationships with several of the governments, and we continue to advise. We continue to help them to think through how they can solve some of their problems by themselves, rather than go cap in hand, to Washington all the time. So those are some of the roles that we play. Blended financing is a very powerful tool that we use a lot. It allows us to mix different pools of capital into a project, whilst ensuring that the key risks of those different pools of capital are sort of taken care of. And an example I can give in this regard is a fund which we set up about 2 years ago called the Infrastructure Climate Resilient Fund. What we did with that fund is that we realized that because as an institution, we continue to invest in fossil fuels, as I mentioned before. For us, it's a balanced approach. And so we knew that there are certain types of investments that we would like to do that we may not necessarily be able to do on our balance sheet because we cannot attract the capital for those investments. So we set up a fund which we manage, and we design the use of the capital coming into that fund around investing in climate resilient projects and projects that speak to mitigation. It's a $750 million fund. The first LP that joined the fund was the Green Climate Fund from Korea. They put $250 million. We've raised about $500 million out of the 750 now. We're now into the investing phase. So we're not going to do that investment on the AFC balance sheet. Rather, we have raised money from around the world, curated into a special fund, and that fund will now go into this kind of EV projects because that capital is patient, that capital is developmental in nature, and so it is well suited for this kind of projects. So those are the kind of solutions we do. So that's just an example of how we play, for sure.
And I guess, that's great to hear. I'm happy that. But turning the question to Eric and Simon, what solutions have you been using so far in terms of financing solutions, either with manufacturer, customer, or banking solutions that balance, because obviously from your perspective, it needs to be both affordable, right, but also bankable. So how do you play with this mix in your businesses?
So, yeah, I think there's the huge opportunity in Africa is serving the average punter and the average business, right? That's, and I think it's important not to be constrained by the models that are being used elsewhere. Ultimately in the UK, we're still buying and selling vehicles the same way Henry Ford started out 100 years ago, and it's not a very sensible way of doing things, right? And you said, climate assets are more expensive, and I think that can be true. Like with cars, China has passed price parity between EVs and petrol vehicles some time ago. Tesla has proved to be more profitable than Mercedes and BMW, despite the fact they only make electric cars. And I think actually there are some real advantages. Ultimately, an EV vehicle might cost you more up front, but it costs you a lot less to run. So actually, when you're doing ultimately you've got a bigger asset to finance, and you've got a greater margin on the product. It's a great way around to have things. So I think the first thing is that we have to be imaginative about how we finance this transition. So for example, we deliver our transport as a service. Users pay for the space on the back of the truck. We don't sell trucks to end customers. We sell trucks to operators of our vehicles for whom are getting a lower cost vehicle as they operate it. So it's a win-win from that point of view. It's cheaper for the customer, and it's more financeable from a asset point of view.
Yeah, I definitely don't think the DFIs are the solution. I mean, I think the $4 trillion that Abdullah was talking about is where the solution comes from, because it is there. I mean, the amount of free cash in the system is a lot. And when opportunities come, that cash does go to work. So we know it's possible. I've tried on occasion to raise money from local high net worths. Not that easy, because I guess what doesn't exist so clearly is enough exits. Stock markets aren't that liquid. So I think there's a layer of things, but neither was the West 50 to 100 years ago. So I guess you kind of need, ideally the money should come from the local system. But in the short term, yes, the DFIs can play a role to help de-risk funding. And there is value in that. But it shouldn't be pegged at all to that kind of money in the long term. Yeah. So we raise money from many different sources, venture capital. I mean, we took money from a fund in Ghana called Njaro, where the LP is the local pension funds. That's fantastic. Like that kind of stuff you want to see more of.
Yeah, there's a huge opportunity in pension. My parents used to live in Switzerland, and their pension funds own a whole chunk of real estate, right? And they generate. E-mobility is a very similar proposition, right? It's a revenue stream on an asset. It's perfect for pension fund investment.
Oh, that's great. And I mean, from I think Impacta perspective, we're also trying, to raise money from pension funds. But when you go speak to a UK pension fund, you're trying to convince them, okay, stop investing in the FTSE 100, invest in a solar farm in Botswana. They raise eyebrows, and I think that's what the role that DFIs can play in de-risking, in providing this first loss, providing this.
In the UK, we have a massive problem that 6% of UK pension fund money is in UK equities. It's tiny, and that's in the UK. Like it's gone to a number of other sources.
Now, let me just quickly add that. I think it's an important point you made, and I like the point that was made around that solution is around that $4 trillion. And increasingly, we as DFIs see our role now way beyond just deploying balance sheets. I think that's what I was talking about. It's like it's not about the DFIs investing, and that is why a key part of our job these days is really transforming into advocacy and advisory. My CEO, for example, spends a lot of time traveling everywhere, meeting one president to the next president, and we just hope that they listen, because we have deployed our balance sheet on the continent for 17 years, for example, in AFSIC. Other institutions much longer. And we have made money every single year. We have paid dividends every single year. So we've shown that, okay, you can make money investing in Africa. But more importantly, we're now putting out a developmental impact report. We issued the first of that last year. It's available on the public domain. If you Google, you can find it. And we're showing them that this is what you can rapidly scale, but allow us to advise on how this institutional capital can be deployed, such that we de-risk it, as you rightly mentioned, in different forms. The guarantee is just one option, of the ways we can de-risk it. The fund option is also there. So there are many different ways we can work with that capital to really change the narrative over time.
Oh, thanks so much. I think just moving the topic a little bit more to the EV value chain, right? I mean, I think two questions. One, is how can Africa position itself not just as a consumer of imported EV equipment, right, but actually as a participant in the e-mobility value chain globally, and from assembly to recycling, I think from vehicle parts, battery charging. What challenges are you seeing at the moment in your business, and how do you think Africa can not be just a consumer of imported products, but also a potential manufacturer of them? Maybe start with Eric first.
Yeah. Okay. I think you need to take quite a long-term position here. Just copy what China did 50 years ago, literally. I mean, they started to manufacture and copy everybody in the world, and today they produce quality at good price. And so it's a stage game. I mean, should Africa get involved and put its head at doing manufacturing today? I don't know. Assembly, they can do it, and a lot of companies do it. You have phone assembly, you have TV assembly, you have car assembly. A lot of things are already happening on the ground. So I think you kind of need a long-term view of how you want to get there. I mean, once you get into EVs, it's complex. Chips, components, motor, it's a lot of complexity there, but you can leverage all this tech out of China in the short term and then start puzzling together piece by piece how you get to that big scale, raw manufacturing and innovation happening in Africa, which is possible. It doesn't have to be tomorrow or in 10 years. Like it needs a path to get there. I mean, I think the easiest thing today is to leverage China as much as you can and take pieces of that onto the ground. Assembly is definitely the first piece from a just pure EV side.
Yeah, I think I concur with that. I've worked in the automotive sector for 20 years. Like China took if you're crude about it, an IP theft route to automotive. If you wanted to go and build vehicles in China, you had to do so with a Chinese partner, and that Chinese partner would build more of your vehicles than they told you would and take them out, stick a Bayfront badge on them. And people knew it happened, but there was no choice because you played in the Chinese market and it was critical. And now, of course, Western brands were king, VW, etc. Now the Chinese have overtaken them, and we're starting to see the reverse going the other way. So, it's a decent strategy, right? If Chinese want to be selling vehicles into Africa, come here, teach us how to do it. That's part of the requirement. I think there's also opportunity on the other end, like forcing some mineral beneficiation or whatever the word is, right? So up processing rather than just being allowed to take raw material out and all the processing happening elsewhere. I think our strategy at Ox is, I was an engineer and a strategist and then got into building software, and I realized how software is built is very different from the way projects traditionally built. You build on other people's components. You don't write code from scratch. And so what we've done with Ox is take the same approach with hardware. We use lots of off-the-shelf bits. So we've got a battery coming out of China. It's super cheap, far cheaper than I could get it out of Europe. And in reality, building half-ton batteries in Africa is a long way off. However, all of the components that are unique to us, we have designed to be built within the technology set that's available. And partly that's enabled by the as-a-service model. Because with an as-a-service model, you're primarily focused on operating cost and moving stuff. You're not focused on showroom appeal. And so we can bring manufacturing localization while importing stuff. And then, as Eric said, you can gradually build on that and go, hang on a minute, we can do that bit here rather than bring it in. So it will take 20, 30 years, but it's possible.
And I think there's a positive circle around that, right? Because if you have assembly locally, if you have spare parts locally, it also helps you in terms of maintenance and also creates more jobs, and there's a positive cycle there.
Yeah, absolutely.
The thing I was just going to quickly add, because I think they made the point, is really, as you rightly said, it's easy to say, put regulations in place. And I'll use Guinea as an example. Massive bauxite deposits in Guinea. I'm sure a lot of you know. And over the years, they've always had a clause in the mining convention that says that, the foreign investors who are mostly mining the bauxite there have to beneficiate. They all have to build a smelter to renew their conventions. And a lot of those conventions were due for renewal in the last maybe 4 or 5 years. And a lot of them just had to go back to the table and said, we needed A, B, C, D. We haven't provided them. The enabling environment is not there. To move from just mining bauxite to smelting bauxite, you need 7 times the power requirements of mining. To move from smelting to refining, you need like 13 times the power requirements. So African governments need to think about how do we also solve the challenge of providing solutions to generate power at scale, competitively, right? And that's something that we spend a lot of time on as well. We're doing a lot of power investment, the odd 50 megawatts there, 300, 350 there, and all of that. But we need to continue to think about how do we do this at scale, because you need power to industrialize. You need infrastructure and other things, but power is easily the biggest cost component and the main deterrent. So while we continue all of the regulatory parts and things like that, we need to solve the challenge of power.
Thanks so much. I had a few other questions to ask, but apparently we're running out of time. So I just wanted to open the opportunity to the audience in case you have questions to the panelists. Please raise your hand and can be addressed.
God, somebody must have a question. We can't have been that boring. They're all asleep.
If not, I'm happy to ask another one.
Maybe we'll set it all.
Yeah. We've said everything there is to be said. They're all scribbling down frantically, right? It's all going to be on Wikipedia by the end of the day.
You're two good panelists. But if not, I'm happy to.
Well then, we've got a question.
Yeah.
Just shout.
I'll just shout it out.
If you could please just, tell...
My name's Kino, and I work at Acre Impact Capital. So my question relates to the funding side of projects. So you mentioned sometimes you get in a situation where if you are funding with a Western European DFI or institution, they were going to impose Western European requirements to unlock the cash they have. And sometimes, I think you touched on it earlier, it's not necessarily applicable given where, I don't know, you can't make a city all electric when, even public transport is still an issue, right? You can't go straight to electric cars. How do you manage that discussion with them to try and align, unlock that funding, but be also pragmatic that, look, I think there are a couple of steps that you need to get to before we can reach that stage in that discussion?
I'm not sure, if I go first, I'm not sure I'd quite describe it. I think realistically, we could electrify Africa's transport in 15 years, right? The challenges are more around the number of people and stuff like that rather than fundamentally the electrification. You may as well build the right thing. If you're building something new, you may as well build it right rather than build it wrong. Maybe you could answer more on the funding side of things.
I think it's a really, really important question. And as you were asking the question, I thought I was like, okay, maybe he sees my everyday life, because those are the kind of things we deal with every day. But the simple answer, if I have to give a short answer to it, is that it's not every dollar that you have to take. So we are very disciplined about who we take money from, where we take money from. And then the second part of the response is that we're geography agnostic. So we don't align with one particular geopolitical region. AFC, I'm speaking for AFC, we raise money everywhere. I think the only place we are yet to fully crack in terms of capital raising is the US. We raise money from China, from Korea, from Japan, from the Middle East. We did a Swiss bond recently. So we engage very multilaterally and in a diverse manner. So if we can't find the right solution from Dubai, maybe we'll find it in Norway. If we don't find it in Norway, maybe we'll find it in China. So we're very diverse and we're very open-minded. Our engagements are very multilateral and very extensive, which means that we're not forced, quote unquote, we don't have to take the dollars from a capital provider that has requirements we can't meet. And we have turned down big names and big money before. I'll give you one example. I won't mention the name, of course, but this capital provider needed some level of representation on our board, which was against our policy. And we knew that if we gave them that level of representation, their influence would become too much, and then we start to pander to that geopolitical region. And we refused the money. So it's just what it is. We're very practical about how we engage, and we are solutions-oriented. We want to do the deal, but we're not desperate to take the money at the end of the day.
I completely agree with what Abiola said. obviously we all want to raise some money for our business, but choosing the right partners, they actually understand the sector you're operating and the countries you're operating, and they will hold your hand or be next to you when needed. Or I think that's a very important point in raising money. And I think we're running out of time, so I would like to thank again the panelists for their excellent insights, good provocations. Thanks the audience for participating in this panel, and wish you all a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.